Welcome to the Tuva Project. Today we're going to wrap up our series on calculating ED visits from medical claims data. So in the first part in our series, we focused on how do we even identify ED visits in professional and institutional claims. Then in the second part, we had to think about, okay, now that we've identified these ED visit claims, how do we merge them together into encounters or visits? And we actually did even a second video after we walked through that conceptually to explain the algorithm, because the algorithm for doing that is fairly complex. Today we're going to wrap up the series. It's going to be a shorter video, and we're just going to go through the nuts and bolts of how do we distinguish between the different types of ED visits. There's actually ED visits that just end in the emergency department. The patient is discharged from there. But there's also ED visits where the patient is then kind of goes into observation. They're not admitted, but they're not discharged, and they stay under observation for a period of time. And then there's actually a large number of ED visits that result in admission to the hospital where the patient meets criteria for admission. And it's important to distinguish these things, because when you're doing analytics, you kind of want to different types of analyses. When you're looking at emergency departments, you might care more about just ED visits or actually ED visits that result in admission. So it's important to understand this distinction. So that's what we're gonna go through today. Quickly, let's just kind of recap what we learned previously in kind of the first two parts. So in terms of identifying ED visits and professional claims, we use HCPCS codes. There's kind of a standard set of 9928X emergency medicine HCPCS codes. These are E&M codes that are billed by emergency medicine physicians in an ED. But then also you can see critical care codes 9929X used in the ED for really intense cases. But in those cases, we require a place of service code equal to 23, which is for the emergency department. So in the Medicare claims data set that we were running all these statistics on, it's the Medicare LDS claims data for 2022 and 2023. This results in a little over 1.6 million unique claims. And then for institutional claims, it's also fairly simple to identify the claims that are ED related. It's the 045X revenue center codes plus 0981, and this results in a little over 1.7 million unique claims. And so across professional and institutional, we have a little more than 3.4 million claims that are related to ED visits from that criteria in our claims data set. But now we get into the more complex thing. How do we merge those claims into encounters? I'm not going to fully go through that here, but just to recap quickly, it kind of goes in two parts. The first part is creating the base encounter. This is where we merge institutional claims together. And at a very high level, this involves, to merge two institutional claims, we have the same patient ID, we have the same facility NPI, and we have some sort of overlapping date. The claims are at least touching on one or more days. And then after we've created that base encounter, we need to add professional claims to the base encounter. And we do that by, again, looking at the patient ID and looking at overlapping dates for those ED professional claims. And so again, if we kind of started at a little more than 1.7 million institutional claims, creating those base encounters doesn't really drop that down by that much. We're only merging about 5,000 claims based on the criteria that I just went through. But the final number of encounters actually ends up being a little over 1.9 million when we add in the professional claims. And so you can see that this is a big difference. If you were just counting distinct claims, you're getting a number that's 3.4 million versus total unique encounters, you're getting a number that's 1.9 million. So very, very different number. So now let's get into like the different types of states. So that 1.9 million number, that really represents our total number of ED visits in the population. Now let's see how many were ED with observation. Our criteria for doing that is fairly simple. There's a couple HCPCS codes that indicate services delivered in an observation setting. And then there's one revenue center code that's the dominantly used revenue center code for this. And so we use some really simple logic. We just say, hey, for all those encounters that we created, let's go back and look at all the HCPCS and Revenue Center codes on any line of any of the claims associated with those encounters. And if we find at least one instance of any of these things, that ED visit was an ED with an observation stay. So that's the really simple logic for doing that. Now let's jump over to ED with admission. We'll look at some numbers here in just a second of how this shakes out. But in terms of ED with admission, we're the kind of just like we had a few videos in the series on how do you identify ED visits. Identifying acute inpatient admissions, there's some complexity to it. A very simple kind of first approximation is like look at claims that have a DRG, right? And that's just what we're going to do here. We'll have a whole separate series on how do you actually identify and create acute inpatient visits from claims, kind of mirroring this ED series. But for today's example, we'll just say any valid DRG on a claim. And so that's what we're doing here. We're just going back through all the claims associated with the encounters that we created, and we're saying, hey, is there a DRG code? And you could even go further and require, the DRG code is valid. In the core medical claim table and the Tuva data model, that's already done, so I don't have to do that here. So I just say where DRG is not null. And here's how it all shakes out. So of those 1.9 million and change ED visits, 62% are ED only, a little less than 27% were ED with admission, and a little over 11% were ED with observation. And so you can see these are the rough percentages of kind of what happens with the classification or how we distinguish different types of ED visits that we calculate from medical claims data. Now, granted, this is on Medicare fee-for-service data. These percentages will be different for different lines of business, commercial, Medicaid, et cetera. But that should give you a sense of how to distinguish these different types of visits and what the relative proportions are when you look at real claims data.